Consumer robotics is an area that really captures the public imagination. This is primarily based on popular science fiction. Today, consumer robotic vendors are creating devices that make that science fiction a reality. I'm talking to Nick Maynard, our lead analyst, about our most recent research on this topic. Welcome, Nick. First of all, maybe tell us an overview of the report and what it contains.
Okay, so what the report contains is it's a really extensive coverage of, firstly, where the consumer robotics market is today, and secondly, where that's heading in future. And how the report does that is, firstly, we break that into several segments. So there's 6 primary segments here. So we're talking about task robotics, entertainment, education, transport, healthcare, and social. So those are the main categories we categorise by. And then what we do is we look at key trends in each of those categories, and that really allows us to produce really detailed forecasts for each of those areas, and we've got benchmark 5-year forecasts for each of those segments. And then to tie that all together, we have a great 15 vendor leaderboard in the report, which allows us to look at all of the really important vendors in the space, what they're doing, and where we think they're headed. So overall, a great overview of the market.
So could you give us a flavour of the key takeaways from the report? Sure.
So the first key takeaway, I think, is that the consumer robotics market as a whole is really in a state of flux. And the primary reason for that is that in the last 18 months, we've had quite a high number of high-profile insolvencies of consumer robotics vendors. And that's primarily being for the reason that these devices, they're often on a one-off purchase model, so they have quite a high average sales price. But then really there's no mechanism to get repeat revenues out of that customer. So what happens is that these consumer robotics vendors have raised quite a lot of money to start with, but really they haven't been able to capitalise on that going forward. So what that leaves us with is a real requirement for innovation in the space. And one of the key takeaways of the report was that vendors need to find ways to move to more subscription-based models, which allow repeat revenues. And that will really put the market on a more sustainable footing going forward. One of the other key takeaways is how important educational and coding tools are becoming. And that's really primarily for the reason that STEM, and by that I mean science, technology, engineering and maths, those subjects are becoming absolutely crucial to the future of work. And there's a real push by governments and parents worldwide to get more emphasis on those subjects. And what robotics vendors are doing is building in coding tools into these robots that allow the user to create custom actions, to really control how the robot works. And while that isn't hugely advanced, it's the first step down that process of these, integrating with these STEM subjects. And that's really interesting. And that's something that's starting to gain traction across all of the segments in consumer robotics.
What would you say the hottest segments are for the robotics industry, and do we forecast them in the report?
So what comes out of the forecast is that the hottest segment we've identified is that of domestic aid or task robotics. And that's really things like your Roomba that will hoover the house on an automatic basis, or a automated lawnmower. What those devices are doing is they're allowing the sort of time-poor users to get these sort of fairly basic tasks automated, and that makes a real difference to people's lifestyles. And for that reason, we think that domestic aid robotics is going to be a really big proportion of shipments going forward. In 2024, we forecast that domestic aid shipments will account for 63% of all shipments in the space. So it's going to be a really big driver. The second segment we've identified as really hot is the entertainment robotics area. And primarily in that area, it's drones leading the shipments at the moment. And those have, although they have been more popular in past, I think drones are reaching maturity insofar as there's an established feature set. There's a big market of hobbyists that want to use the devices, and how it's really become an established industry now. Those two will drive shipments, and that's going to drive shipments from just 28 million in 2019 all the way to 74 million in 2024. So that's going to be some really strong growth.
Okay, so turning to the markets and the players in the market, included as a leaderboard in the research. Take us through that. Who are the winners?
Okay, so sort of, in a similar vein to the forecast, we're thinking that the entertainment robotics and the domesticated robot manufacturers are coming out on top. There are established leaders in the leaderboard. So I'll give you two examples. Firstly, DJI is a Chinese manufacturer of drones, and they've really developed a really strong reputation in the market for quality devices, and they've added features and iterated their models over and over, and they've become quite good at creating a really compelling user proposition. The other example is the company iRobot, who manufacture the Roomba device we mentioned earlier. But what they've done is they've expanded across areas. So instead of just producing a vacuum cleaner, now they have an automated lawnmower or an automated mop. So they've managed to add loads of features, and even things such as smart home mapping and integration with voice assistants. So they've been really successful at adding value to the proposition. If we look at sort of the challengers, one really interesting challenger is a company called Sphero, which has had a bit of a history in the licensed entertainment robotics area. It produced a tie-in robot for Star Wars: The Force Awakens of BB-8 that was really well received. But actually what it found was that was sort of a one-off, and that they needed to pivot to the education segment. So actually it's changed its business model and has become quite effective in doing that.
Okay, so finally, Nick, what are your strategic recommendations for the market?
So I think there's several key recommendations I'd make. Firstly, voice assistants have a lot of value to add in the area. And what you've got to bear in mind is that in a lot of cases, people won't consider basic robots to be the competition in the consumer robotics segment. They'll consider things like a Alexa Echo Dot to be a competition for a robot. So what vendors need to make sure they're doing is that they're building those voice assistant capabilities into the robots themselves. And we've already seen this with the Chinese manufacturer Ubitech has built in a voice assistant to one of its robots. But I think it's something that can gain momentum in the market. And I think that will add value, increase the user proposition, and make those robots part of the wider smart home ecosystem, which has got great potential. And another strategic recommendation is really to keep the devices affordable. I mean, I mentioned just now that one of the main competition to these devices will be those voice assistant enabled devices, the Echo Dot, for example. Now, what you find is that those devices are really cheap. Their average sales price is a lot cheaper than some of these consumer robotic devices. So what vendors need to make sure they're doing is that they can justify the difference in average sales price between the voice assistant enabled devices and their consumer robot. If they can keep the average price of those devices down, then they'll have really good success in the market. And finally, I'd recommend that manufacturers really double down on those coding tools, because they have really become popular in the market. I mean, Lego has done very well with its Boost range. Coding is something that I think is going to be enduringly popular. And that's a really great differentiator for a consumer robotics device. So I think that's really where manufacturers need to focus.
Excellent, Nick. Thank you very much. If you'd like to know more about this topic, then please get in touch or visit our website. See you next time. Thank you.